I remember these words from the Bible. There is no other love rather than if someone gives soul for their friends.
That was Russian President Vladimir Putin addressing a packed stadium on March 18th earlier this year, the 8th anniversary of the Crimean annexation. The rally is reminiscent of a Soviet propaganda events, and here Putin is quoting from the book of John in the Bible. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. He's invoking Christian scriptures to explain why he started the so-called special operation, the war in the Donbass and the larger invasion of Ukraine. Amid these international sanctions that have been imposed upon him, Putin has been tightening control on the media outlets in Russia, actively arresting war protesters, including children, and he has turned to the Russian Orthodox Church for religious support in his war of aggression.
Putin's actions, his use of religious language as pointed culture wars rhetoric, and his support by some conservative religious actors, including here in the US, have painted this invasion as a war of morality, of good versus evil, perhaps even a holy war. Putin's language about Ukraine emphasizes anti-Semitism and anti-westernism, and promotes what he views as traditional values, including religious values. So is Vladimir Putin a religious zealot, a ruthless cynic? Is he the face of a new post-Soviet fascist state?
All of these questions are linked. They're part of larger issues of religion, politics, the way we use media to follow the war in real time.
I'm Tracy Fessenden.
And I'm John Carlson.
This is Recovering Truth, a podcast from Arizona State University's Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. Today, we're joined by two scholars who will help us think more about the role of religion and media in Russia's war against Ukraine and its appeal to some far-right communities in the United States.
Sarah Riccardi-Swartz is a postdoctoral fellow here with us at the Recovering Truth Project and the author of Between Heaven and Russia, Religious Conversion and Political Apostasy in Appalachia. She is a scholar of religion, media, and politics in the United States with a particular focus on Orthodox Christianity.
Jacob Lassen is a postdoctoral research scholar at the Malikian Center for Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies. His research focuses on the intersection of religion, politics, literature, and new media in Russia and the former Soviet Union. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
We've seen strong support for Ukraine and opposition to Russia across a political spectrum in the U.S. We've also seen some backpedaling among some American public figures when it comes to condemning in strongest terms Putin's invasion and what appear to be the ongoing war crimes of the Russian army. So the question for me to start off with is, why would some Americans support Putin? What do they find appealing about him or his politics or his conduct of this war? I'm thinking of the Russian Orthodox Church especially. Sarah, would you like to begin?
Sure. I think there's a growing interest among some American conservatives and far-right groups with European and Eurasian authoritarianism. And even while McConnell is fighting back against sort of this isolationism that's part of more extreme expressions of conservatism among the GOP, there are so-called non-elites touting Putin's praises. And there are also religious converts to the Russian Orthodox Church in the United States who are seemingly enchanted with Putin's policies. I think in many respects, the support for Putin in the U.S. is a grassroots movement of disparate yet conversational right-wing groups that believe Putin is sort of curating a social reality in which secularism and diversity are not welcome. And I'm sure Jacob can speak about how this is untrue as an imaginary in terms of what's actually happening on the ground in Russia. But to the question of why some Americans, especially far-right Christians, might support or be taken with his politics, we do know that Putin markets himself very well as a seemingly devout Christian who attends services, who goes to confession, who has a spiritual father. He has a pretty cozy relationship with the Moscow Patriarchate. And so it certainly seems as if Putin's emphasis on family values, as Christianity as sort of central to the historical configuration of Russia's history, all of that combined with how he uses religion to bless the troops, to support the armed forces. I think these are all ways that Putin centers religion and morality as sort of the building blocks of a correct society. And some Americans, especially those who want to reclaim some sort of mythic Christian past, they find that rhetoric of family values and the tightening of church and state to be quite compelling.
Yeah, for as Sarah was mentioning, the idea that Russia is this kind of homogenous Christian country is a fabrication. Russia is an extremely ethnically and linguistically, religiously diverse country. So, for instance, if you consider Russia to be part of Europe, Russia is the most Muslim country in Europe by numbers. And so this building of a kind of Orthodox ideology and this idea that Orthodoxy is what brings the country together is really mostly a post-Soviet invention. It was a way of connecting people together to get some kind of guiding force for the country in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the wake of the collapse of communist ideology. And as a result, we have this strengthening of the relationship between church and state that you see, that Sarah already mentioned, in the country. You see the patriarch and other high-ranking bishops at lots of different political events. You see Putin assiduously attending services for Christmas, for Easter, and so on. But for the most part, if you look at actual religious attendance, actual religious engagement, and of course, church attendance itself is only one indicator, but it's very, very low in Russia. So if we're looking at that, for instance, then it's much lower than the United States. It's a much less, quote unquote, Christian country from that point of view. What Sarah was also mentioning about kind of the affinity towards Eastern European and Eurasian authoritarian or liberal leaders around the world, you see that also with kind of an interest in what Viktor Orban is doing in Hungary, what the leaders in Poland have done with the Law and Justice Party, and then of course also with Putin and what is going on in Russia. And taking this all together, it's kind of this, what Christina Stockel, a scholar in Austria, calls part of the global culture wars. So we see here this kind of looking to Putin as a leader in the global culture wars around the world.
Sarah, you're a scholar of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. Tell us a little bit about what that is and how their interests, their politics, differ from or intersect and overlap with other members of the right in the United States who are not part of that Russian Orthodox community.
So the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, generally known by its acronym ROCOR, is a semi-autonomous religious organization that since 2007 has been under the protection of the Moscow Patriarchate if we think about a church umbrella organization. They came back into communion after almost 80 years of not being in communion with the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia. And they were originally a group of white Russian, Tsarist Russians who were very fearful that the Soviet Union was going to completely disrupt Orthodoxy in Russia, and they needed to somehow preserve Orthodoxy outside of Russian spaces in order to eventually, after the fall of the Soviet Union, go back to Russia and sort of remissionize it. So this religious organization has developed in isolation to some extent because they wanted to preserve pre-revolutionary forms of Russian Orthodoxy. What's distinct about them is that they were originally an immigrant faith, and now they are attracting white, typically male American converts to the faith. And so their demographics as a religion are changing, especially since the mid-2000s to the early 2010s, when we saw rapid movement towards ROCOR among white males. In terms of being different or the same than other conservative or right-wing religious groups in the United States, I'd say that they're one of many far-right religious communities that are trying to grapple with what secularism means for them when they don't believe in secularism, and they see their religious values as sort of in opposition to secularism and progressivism.
In his defense of the war, Putin has used the language of religious heritage and propaganda about Western secular values. So help us understand how this appeal may be similar to or different from the approach that some on the right are using here in the United States.
Well, a lot of Putin's appeal, especially his anti-Western appeal, centers around issues related to sexual morality and gender identity and those sorts of questions. And that's kind of directly related to what we're seeing here in the United States, for instance, with all of the laws that various state governments are passing to discriminate against trans individuals, all of the language that you hear from the right here now in the United States about grooming among gay groups or whatever. And so that kind of language and the way that, the idea of opposing it and seeing, your side as being the holy side, the side that is on the side of religion, and this is kind of the godless people with no real values, no real principles, are directly related. And, I guess it's now probably over 10 years ago now, Russia passed a law basically banning what they called gay propaganda to youth, to minors. And that kind of law is basically a direct parallel to the Don't Say Gay Florida law. So in a lot of ways, we're seeing what happened in Russia already starting to play out here.
Yeah, I would say that, both countries sort of use the idea of diversity in different ways in terms of conservative politics. I think that Putin is using the language of religious heritage and propaganda as part of a sort of shaping narrative of imperial expansion that seeks to wipe out diversity. So, cultural, religious, ethnic, I would argue, given the anti Semitism we've seen in Russian propaganda, sexual and gender, as Jacob just talked about. I mean, you recall that the Patriarch of Moscow signaled out gay pride parades in his sermon justification of the war in Ukraine. And I also think at the same time, Putin is using the language of shared religious heritage when he talks about, and he talked about this prior to this latest incursion in Ukraine, but he's also talked about it since. He talks about the baptismal font of Kiev, and he says how Russians and Ukrainians have a shared history in that baptismal font. And so, in his attempt to sort of preserve the spiritual unity of Russia and Ukraine, he's suppressing Ukrainian independence and resistance. And so, I think much of his language is similar to what we see on the right. It's just packaged with Russian Orthodoxy and nationalism in a different register, but it has the same sort of guiding impulse, that of wiping out diversity.
So, Jacob, this is a continuation, obviously, then of a long running effort to capitalize on what we would call these global culture wars. But when it comes specifically to the invasion of Ukraine, how has Putin been able to make these kinds of religious and moral appeals, again, given that he's invaded another country?
So the number one tool that is enabling Putin to be able to do this and to get a good percentage of the population behind him is the decades long kind of creep that the state has done to take over media. So the state basically dominates all of kind of traditional broadcast media at this point, and especially in the wake of the war in Ukraine. Basically any independent media in Russia is either illegal to access or shut down because they wanted to protect their employees. So the fact that state media is basically the only game in town and is able to broadcast these messages all the time makes it a very lopsided picture is what the average Russian is seeing on their television screen or even from the radio, etc. Also, what Putin has been able to do in kind of using the rhetoric of morality and kind of Russia's messianic role is to combine, this latest military invasion with not only kind of the past mythic Christian past, Russia's long-standing role as kind of leader in the Orthodox world, and also with the very important role that the Soviet Union played in World War II. And, World War II, or as it's known mostly in Russia, the Great Patriotic War, is this seminal foundational moment, especially for the modern Russian state. And so when Putin says things like, we're going in to denazify this country, this already brings up the kind of good and evil fights, right, between the Red Army that got rid of fascism from the world and, of course, the Nazis. The idea, of course, that Ukraine is a Nazi country or something is an absolute absurdity, especially with a Jewish president. It had a Jewish prime minister. But being able to link all of these things together, kind of Russia's holy mission, World War II as this apocalyptic fight against good and evil, and now the war in Ukraine to make sure that those gains are protected, that is kind of the larger rhetorical trope that we're seeing throughout.
And in combination with that propaganda war that, Jacob, you've detailed, Russia has had an almost complete information blackout of sources that might provide outside news and connections to Russian citizens, other views of Ukraine. So help us to understand this information blackout in the context of media censorship and anti-democracy movements we've seen in Russia and elsewhere. And how might we understand the connection between anti-democracy movements in Russia and anti-democracy movements in the United States?
I mean, Jacob is right. There has been this, it's a great word, creep towards basic control of all media outlets in Russia. And, it's part of that continuation of the mediatization of the political and the post-Soviet context, right? Like, that was a term that came into use during the Yeltsin administration, the idea of political technology, and they're doing it still very, very well today. I mean, we think about concerns over Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election, and we're actively witnessing every day the sort of telescopic transnational expression of repressive political arts through both the blackouts in Russia, but also the way in which Putin is mobilizing his friends and allies abroad. I mean, of course, you have people who have converted to Russian Orthodoxy, but you also have far-right actors in the US who are in favor of Putin and who are creating these sort of underground online networks to mobilize support for him among far-right actors. So I think that Putin is actually very smart in terms of how he's creating both a space in which outside information is heavily curated and or completely shut out in Russia. But at the same time, he's reaching out from Russia abroad to find people who can support him elsewhere.
I think one thing I'd like to add is that even when right-wing commentators here in the U.S., and especially so-called mainstream right-wing commentators, there's still a lot of hesitancy to assist Ukrainians or to fully declare that Russia is kind of the aggressor in this case. There seems to be a desire to kind of both sides it or to condemn U.S. military overreach and imperialism. And this seems to be rooted in this idea that Putin still is defending something worth holding on to. And that even if we don't agree with his exact approach to things, even if we think, the patriarch is inserting language that's a little cynical to, all of a sudden mention gay pride parades when talking about the war, that when push comes to shove, they might have a point. And this is kind of their move where, by soft peddling these ideas, they're able to at least, sow some doubt and to make it seem like, oh, maybe there is a little bit more complication here, and maybe we shouldn't just, support the Ukrainians, even though they're the ones actually being invaded.
Yeah. And I would also say that in terms of anti-democracy, I think we have to make sure that we understand very clearly how technology is playing a role in the shifting political views of people on the right who are very anti-democratic or pro-authoritarianism. I mean, technology is this link that helps them build their ideological movements. And even, I think, paradoxically, sometimes as they decry big tech, because you see among the far right globally this sort of decrying of modernization, of technology as bad as, I mean, even in Patriarch Kirill has said that technology will bring about the rise of the Antichrist. But at the same time, they're using technology to build these movements, these grassroots movements. And I think that's really important because sometimes we focus on anti-democracy in terms of the elites and leaders, but we don't often think about how it's actually happening on the ground. And media is one way that is happening.
So how do you see this playing out, and specifically what kinds of efforts can be undertaken to try to counter the rise of these anti-democratic movements that are forming across information spheres and across multiple continents here?
Well, I think if we're talking from a religious angle, I think some of the denominations need to step up and actually, look internally and talk to their parishioners, talk to their congregants, and try to root this stuff out. If people are out there saying, I represent the Catholic Church, for instance, the Orthodox Church, whatever, and that they're not getting any pushback, or they're even getting support from bishops or other leaders, then that seems to be condoning of the actions. And so I think there needs to be a lot of soul searching within these religious groups to figure out, first of all, why is this happening within our communities? Why are we attracting these people if we are? And what can we do to actually stop this before it becomes, synonymous with our entire religious movement?
But it's not just religious leaders in, say, the Orthodox Church, because there's all sorts of folks who are on the American far right who are not Orthodox, who seem to be supporting the nationalist agenda that Putin is advancing here and undercutting the efforts to challenge that.
Yeah, I would say that we have to look carefully as scholars at what's happening in terms of politics and religion in the United States. We are seeing, strangely, and since the mid 2010s, a turn towards authoritarian and populist ideas among conservatives in the United States. And so, as a social science researcher, the question for me is, why is this happening? And why does it often seem to be religiously inclined people, as Jacob noted, who are geared towards these ideas? What does that mean? Does it mean for them that something's missing from the American political landscape? Or does it mean that their religious values are agreeable with ideologies that promote hatred? So as a researcher, I'm interested in why these ideas are here, why they're flourishing. And as someone who also is concerned about democracy in the United States and preserving it, I also want to know how we can go into these communities and help people understand why their ideologies, why turning abroad to these foreign powers might actually destroy their home here in the United States.
How do you do that, though? I mean, one thing, given the intensive conflicts and divisions right here in the United States, one thinks back to recent presidential campaigns where at the GOP convention, people were wearing T-shirts that says, better Russian than a Democrat, for example. How do you overcome that kind of division at home when they're that deep-seated?
Well, I'm not sure how Jacob feels about this, but I think I agree with him. It does start with talking to people in your community. So if you're part of a religious organization and you see that in your community, talk to people, talk to your clergy members, talk to your friends, try to understand what's going on and why people feel this way. I worked with far right converts to the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. And many times when I sat down with interviews, they would say, "You're the first person who's ever listened to me or cared about what I had to say." And I think that, building those one-to-one relationships, actually, it takes a lot of time and a lot of work, but it can get there. That's not to say that everybody will change their minds or that they will, reject their views, but it's very hard to hate someone once you've talked to them and you've looked them in the eye and you've had a conversation with them.
I'm just wondering if what we're seeing in the way of opposition to Russia on the right contains with it some seeds of change. I don't know that we'll be seeing shirts at the 2024 Republican convention that say better Russian than Democrat. So maybe that's a place to look for the possibility of some kind of shift.
I mean, we can only hope, right? We do know that there is a strong isolationist strain in the GOP right now, and that there are a lot of people running for Congress and even local seats that have QAnon conspiracies as their platform, that are supporters of Putin. So I think what remains to be seen in the midterms and then in 2024 is how will the right grapple with their relationship to Russia? And I think that that's going to mean a lot for the future of democracy in the United States.
It'll be interesting to see if the kind of two-sided approach that we see the GOP using in a lot of cases. So, for instance, we saw Mitch McConnell and other Republican congressional leaders going and speaking with Zelensky, meeting in Kiev. But I think this was like a day after Rand Paul held up additional aid to Ukraine and kind of slowed down that whole process. So it's, is their strategy basically hoping to appeal to all sides with regard to this issue by saying that, look, we kind of have something for everybody in this sense. Will the QAnon people win out? Will the isolationist wing win out? These are all things that it'll be interesting to see, as Sarah pointed out, going forward.
Jacob and Sarah, thank you so much. We're so grateful to you for sharing your expertise with us today in this podcast, and also for your efforts over the period of your postdoctoral fellowships at ASU. And we wish you the very, very best in your new positions. Jacob, you're headed to Miami University, Ohio, and Sarah is going to Northeastern University in Boston. So we will miss you, and we're very grateful to have had your company and your colleagueship in the past year.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
That was Jacob Lassen and Sarah Riccardi-Swartz. And I'm John Carlson.
And I'm Tracy Fessenden. This podcast is part of the Recovering Truth Project at Arizona State University's Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, supported by a generous grant from the Henry Luce Foundation.
Our producer is Sarah Ventry. Additional assistance from Matt Correa. Our music is by Ketsa.
Recovering Truth is a civic responsibility. Thank you for listening and for joining us in the effort.